Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be talking about the institution that controls the U.S. money supply. Most of you should remember that we talked about the Federal Reserve Bank. Our nation's central bank is that institution. When we're talking about the money supply, there's various measures of the money supply. There's M1, there's M2, and generally M2 is the most common measure of the money supply. So if you need a review over that, go ahead and take a look at those notes, M1 versus M2. So, our focus today is going to be on the Federal Reserve and how they can expand the money supply through what's called multiple deposit expansion. So let's start off by talking about the Federal Reserve, the Fed. There are 12 Federal Reserve District banks that collectively serve as the nation's central bank. So there's 12 Federal Reserve banks, there's one per district. The Federal Reserve is quasi-private and quasi-governmental. It's owned by commercial banks like Bank of America, Chase, and so forth. But it is accountable to Congress, mostly because it was created by Congress. It was created by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. If the Federal Reserve was established by legislation, it can be abolished by legislation. So the Federal Reserve is somewhat accountable to Congress. The Federal Reserve System has many different responsibilities. It controls the money supply, it supervises the member banks, and it acts as a lender of last resort. It is a banker's bank. So if bankers need emergency money, they will go to the Federal Reserve to get that emergency money. So these banks are centrally governed by the Federal Reserve Board of Governors that is located in Washington, D.C. There are 7 members of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. They have 14-year terms. They're appointed by the president. The president also appoints a chairman. The chairman has a 4-year term. Right now, that chairman is Janet Yellen. The Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, assists the board by conducting open market operations, and that's when the Federal Reserve buys and sells bonds to control interest rates. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more at a later time. So this FOMAC is going to have 12 members. It's going to have the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, and there's going to be 5 Fed presidents as well. So a couple of pictures here. This is Mr. Vanderpool pointing at the Federal Reserve building in Washington, D.C. This is the Board of Governors building right there. And here are the pictures of the 12 Federal Reserve districts. So you can see each district has a Federal Reserve Bank. Our closest one, since we're in California, we're in District 12. San Francisco is our closest Federal Reserve Bank, but you've also got Federal Reserve banks in Kansas City, Dallas, St. Louis, Atlanta. If you look on your dollar bills, you can actually see where the dollar bill came out of if you take a look at that. And this is Janet Yellen, and Janet Yellen is the current chairwoman of the Federal Reserve. It's also important to point out, ladies and gentlemen, that the Federal Reserve System has what's called a dual mandate. Okay, they have 2 different goals. One is to keep inflation low. Generally, it's about 2% inflation is the Federal Reserve's current goal, and they want to keep output at full employment. Okay, so maximize output while also keeping inflation low around that 2% level. So now we're going to talk about one very specific tool of monetary policy, one very specific tool that the Federal Reserve uses in order to expand, in this case, expand the money supply. And this is the reserve requirement. The Federal Reserve requires banks to always have some money readily available to meet consumers' demand for cash. So most of you hopefully already understand that banks, when you deposit your money in a bank, the bank doesn't just hold on to that money. The bank is going to lend it out, they're going to invest it, they're going to do something to make money with your money. That's how banks make money. However, the Federal Reserve does require a specific percentage of those deposits to stay on hand at the bank or with the Federal Reserve. This is called the reserve requirement or the reserve requirement ratio. And this does many things. One of the things that it does is it prevents bank runs. So if a substantial amount of people want to have their cash, they can come in and they can get their cash, and the bank will have cash on hand. If they lent it all out, then they won't have any cash on hand, and that could create some major issues. So this amount, this reserve requirement, is set by the Fed. It's called the reserve requirement ratio. It is the percentage of demand deposits, checking account balances that must not be loaned out. And typically the reserve requirement ratio is about 10%. Generally, central banks don't change the reserve requirement very much. I remember a few years ago, China changed the reserve requirement. It was a big old story in the economic world there. All right, so a couple of equations I want you guys to keep in mind. In addition to the reserve requirement, we're also going to be talking about excess reserves and total reserves. Total reserves are the amount of, when we deal with the problems that we're going to be dealing with in a few minutes here, it is the total amount of new money being input into the banking system by the Federal Reserve. And then a percentage of that has to be held, that is your required reserves, and then a percentage of it can get lent out, and that is called your excess reserves. So keeping that in mind, we have an equation here where excess reserves, which is the amount of money that can be lent out, is equal to your total reserves minus your required reserves. So your total reserves, like I said, is the amount of new money being put into the system by the Federal Reserve, and your required reserves are the amount that has to be held. So excess reserves is equal to total reserves minus required reserves, or total reserves is equal to the excess reserves plus the required reserves, which is just basically an algebraic manipulation of the first equation there. Now I want to talk about something specific called the money multiplier. And we've already talked about the spending multiplier, where if the government spends money, that you will have an increase in aggregate demand that is greater than the initial amount spent. This is similar to that, except this has to do with money and the amount of money that's created from an initial deposit. So the money multiplier shows us how the impact of a change in demand deposits on loans and eventually the money supply. It's important to understand that the Federal Reserve will expand the money supply. This money supply is expanded by when banks make loans. When banks make loans, the money supply is expanded. Now, where today's instruction is more going to be on the outcome of this multiple deposit expansion, it's not going to be as much on the process. In a few days, we're going to talk a little bit more about how this money multiplier and how multiple deposit expansion, we're going to look at that process regarding how it actually can create, how it creates more money. This is just looking at the actual outcome of it. Okay. Now to calculate the money multiplier, we're going to divide 1 by the required reserve ratio. So the money multiplier is going to be equal to the 1 over the reserve ratio. So for example, if the reserve ratio is 25%, so banks have to hold 25% of their deposits, then the multiplier is going to be 4, because you're going to take out 25%, make it into a decimal, 0.25, 1 over 0.25 is going to be equal to 4. All right, so 1 over 0.25 is going to be 4. All right, so the Fed can help control the money supply by changing this reserve requirement ratio. If the Fed wants to increase the money supply, they're going to lower the reserve ratio. This allows for more money to be lent out, and this is going to stimulate the economy. It's going to increase the amount of excess reserves, because what's happening is banks have to hold less reserves. Their required reserves goes down, so they can lend out more, which means excess reserves is going to go up. If the Fed wants to decrease the money supply, they want to increase others reserve requirement ratio, because that means these banks have to hold more money, so their excess reserves are going to go down, which means you're not going to have as much money lent out, and this is actually going to go ahead and contract the economy. Okay. Now, there are three different types of multiple deposit expansion questions, and we're going to actually look at all three types in one big problem. So type 1 is calculating the initial change in excess reserves. We already talked about excess reserves is equal to total reserves minus the required reserves, or total reserves is equal to excess reserves plus required reserves. This is going to be the amount a single bank can loan from an initial deposit. The type 2 is going to be calculating the change in loans in the banking system, the maximum change in the money supply. Remember, the money supply changes from this change in loans. So you're looking at the maximum change in loans in the banking system with this type of problem. And type 3 is going to be calculating the total change in the money supply or demand deposit, checkable deposit creation. So this is going to be taking a look at the new money supply total from that initial input of deposits from the Federal Reserve.